All right, well, thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be going to Leviticus chapter 1. So we began a series through the book of Leviticus, and this is now message number 2 in that series, entitled The Birds and the Bulls. And we'll be here in chapter 1, looking at verses 3 through 17. So I'm going to read verses 3 to 9 as we get started. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood around about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into his pieces. And the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priests, Aaron's sons, shall lay the parts, the head, and the fat in order upon the wood that is on the fire which is upon the altar. But his inwards, his legs shall be washed in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. So it was about 3 years ago in Denver, a U.S. representative of Colorado and a guest were in a theater enjoying a play, and perhaps they were enjoying it a little too much because there were numerous complaints that the couple were causing a disturbance, and the theater staff eventually came and instructed them to leave. Well, of course, they refused. And the representative asked the staff more than once, "Do you know who I am?" Now, once the police were called and were actually en route to the theater, they decided to leave. But of course, they didn't leave without giving many assurances that the mayor would be contacted about this incident. Now, that might seem like something trivial, but it does illustrate something about how in our modern world, people all seem to have some sort of entitlement to a special classification. And at least in their own minds, they expect exceptions to be made for them. They expect to receive special treatment. And in the theater, of course, the better seats are usually those more expensive ones that the a little more well-off has access to. And then there's usually those medium-grade seats. And then, of course, there are the cheap seats in the nosebleeds, usually directly behind some sort of building appurtenance. But one's level of wealth may have afforded better seats than the poorest there could pay, but at least that day in that theater, everyone in every seat had to abide by the same rules in order to see the show. Well, Leviticus begins with a statement of no exceptions. If anyone brings an offering, in verse number 2, anyone. Now, the overwhelming theme of Leviticus is, of course, holiness. 4 times in the book, Israel is commanded that they are to be holy because the Lord God is holy, and He is to dwell in their midst in the tabernacle. And of course, no exceptions are given. God sets the standard, and everyone has to submit to it in order to come into His presence and in order to dwell with Him. So then the central problem of the book of Leviticus is, how will Israel live with the holy God in His presence and He dwelling in their midst? I mean, they've already, by this time, you've come through Genesis and Exodus to get to Leviticus, they've already demonstrated their unfaithfulness. they've already demonstrated how that they could not keep the covenant that God gave them at Sinai. And by the time you get into the next book, in the book of Numbers in the Pentateuch, that generation that came out of Egypt and received that covenant at Sinai will all die in the wilderness because of their unbelief and their rebellion against God, even though they committed themselves that they were going to keep every word that God commanded them. Well, the book here of Leviticus opens up with God's presence in the tabernacle, speaking to Moses to instruct the sons of Jacob. And the first 7 chapters give us laws for various offerings and sacrifices. So the message of this book is set right from the very start. God is holy. And to dwell in His presence requires obedience, sacrifice, atonement, and mediation. I certainly hope that any reading of the book of Leviticus will impress upon us just how serious the holiness of God really is, and just how serious our own unholiness and uncleanness before God really is. Well, the first chapter begins with the burnt offerings. And the burnt offerings provide the God-appointed way for anyone of Israel to approach the holy presence of Yahweh through an acceptable substitutionary sacrifice that is given wholly to God. And of course, in this chapter, we learn there are 3 acceptable sacrificial animals. Those that come from the herd, those that come from the flocks, and those that come from the birds. And what they have in common is that all of these animals are domesticated animals. All of these animals are those that are specified by God to be clean animals. And they're also all animals that would serve as food for Israel in a common way. And when done properly, they all result in this repeated phrase in this chapter of an offering that's made by fire and is of a sweet savor. It is of a pleasing and an appeasing aroma to God. So we're going to look at the rest of this chapter in 3 parts, verses 3 to 9, which gives us the offering from the herd, verses 10 to 13, which gives us the offering from the flock, and verses 14 to 17, the offering from the birds. So we're going to start here again in verses 3 to 9 with the offering from the herd. Verse 3, if his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. So at the very beginning we're shown how that the offering, if anyone would bring an offering, anyone bringing an offering, a sacrifice, and the word for offering that's used is a very general term. It covers all types of offerings. Now, particularly when we are talking about the burnt offering, that it talks about that ascends. That's what the indication is. It's referring to the smoke of that offering going up, and as it were, coming into the nostrils of God, so that He smells the aroma, and it is a pleasing smell. It is a smell that satisfies Him, and He tells us when this is done that it will make an atonement for their sins. So the offering from the very start must meet God's requirements. It's not that Israel needs to form an offering committee and that they need to deliberate about what would be a good offering to give to God, what would be a good sacrifice to make. No, He is specifying from the start His requirements for what He is going to accept. And there's 3 qualifications. First, that it comes from the herd, and that it be a male, and that it be without blemish, which of course would be the most valuable domestic animal that they would have in their possession. Now, the worshiper does not determine what constitutes an acceptable approach to God or an acceptable sacrifice to God. But notice that the location here is also significant. He will offer it at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation of the Lord. Well, this whole sacrificial system exists because the presence of God has now come to dwell among Israel in the tabernacle. Now, you recall that the book of Exodus ends with the glory of Yahweh filling this tabernacle. And Leviticus begins with his presence speaking from that tabernacle to Israel through Moses. Verse 4, "And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him." So the worshiper is to place his hand upon the head of the animal being sacrificed. I understand the word actually indicates more than just simply making contact, but it really describes more of what might be a leaning upon, that it's a pressing of the head of the sacrifice. Of course, this associates the worshiper, the offerer who has come with the offering. And it emphasizes and highlights the substitutionary nature of this offering that is being made, that it is going to go in the place of the one who brings it. So the worshiper, the representative sacrifice, and then we're told there's acceptance and atonement. Now this word for atonement, kippur, is used here. It's not something, in other words, it's not a theological concept that's brought in to this description. It is a part of the very code that is given with the Old Covenant. And it has to do with the idea of ransoming, of a covering being made. The life of the substitute, we read in verse 5, "And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priest Aaron's son shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation." So the life of the substitute is given before Yahweh. The worshiper, the one who brings it, is the one who slays this animal, but the priests are the one who handle the blood. We read about how that Aaron's sons and the priest, they'll bring the blood, they'll sprinkle the blood roundabout upon the altar. So immediately we see a distinction that is being made. So the worshiper, the offerer comes, brings this offering, is the one that actually kills it, but the priests are the ones who mediate. The blood is presented before God. Now, of course, we will get a fuller explanation about this blood and this offering of blood later in Leviticus. And the entire sacrifice is prepared for God. So let's start here at verse 6. "And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into his pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priest Aaron's son shall lay the parts, the head, and the fat in order upon the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar." So the offerer comes, and the offerer is the one that's going to cut this animal, is going to divide this carcass up into different pieces. Meanwhile, the priests, the sons of Aaron, these Levitical priests, they'll be arranging the fire, arranging the wood, and then putting the pieces upon the altar. This, of course, is the brazen altar that is outside of the tabernacle that's being talked about. And there's considerable detail that we read about here. But really what we get from this sum of what is happening here is that this entire animal is being prepared for consumption upon God's altar. In other words, there are some sacrifices we'll read about later where some of it is burnt and some of it is to be eaten in a meal. That's not the case with the burnt offerings that are being described here. Sometimes you might hear them referred to as whole burnt offerings, because these are the case where the entire animal is consumed, except of course for the skin, which that is given to the priests. But the whole sacrifice, notice what it says in verse 9, "But his inwards, his legs shall he wash with water. And the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. The whole sacrifice is that ultimately ascends upward. The smoke of the sacrifice, that it ascends upward. The inwards, the parts and the legs and all of these parts are washed. In other words, they are cleansed. They're ceremonially clean, and then the priest shall burn all of it upon the altar. And the result is that it is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, and a sweet savor unto the Lord. Now this signifies the divine acceptance of or the pleasure in this properly offered sacrifice. Now, we've encountered this before in the book of Genesis, but now we are reading these laws as a part of the old covenant, and a part of the code, the law that God had given, and again for the functioning of the tabernacle that he had them made. So we immediately see from the start here that God has provided that an acceptable substitute through which an offerer, a worshiper, may approach his presence through the death and the offering of that substitute. So now we go on to the second description, which is the offering from the flock in verses 10 to 13. And if his offering be of the flocks, namely of the sheep or of the goats, for a burnt sacrifice, he shall bring it, a male without blemish, and he shall kill it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord. And the priest Aaron's son shall sprinkle his blood round about upon the altar. And he shall cut it into his pieces with his head and his fat, and the priest shall lay them in order on the wood that's on the fire which is upon the altar. But he shall wash the inwards and the legs with water, and the priest shall bring it all and burn it upon the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. So we're starting to notice a little bit of a repetitive nature to this, to these offerings, and that will be the case for the third one as well. The burnt offering from the flock receives the same acceptance, and it's offered by the same means. So the sacrifice must again be without blemish. That is being brought, and there's other descriptions of that further in Leviticus as well. But notice that this is now from the flocks. So it is of the sheep, or it's of the goats, which does change the value of the animal, just economically speaking. So we are moving down now to sort of a medium tier domestic animal, part of the livestock. And even though the value of that animal changes, God's standard does not. He does provide for this, again, sort of a medium level animal to be offered, but whether it's a bull or whether it's a sheep or a goat, this sacrifice still must be made according to the law that Yahweh has given. It must be acceptable to Him. Now the substitute again dies before the Lord. He shall kill it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord. So the one bringing this offering is the one that slays this animal. The priests are again handling the blood. The blood is again applied to the altar. And so the central principle of it, and really sort of the central mechanics of what takes place there, isn't changed. It's just merely a different animal. The sacrifice goes on to be completely prepared. The offer that brings it divides it up, cuts it up. It's arranged. The parts are washed. It's the same order, the same procedure, and it reinforces the fact that Israel's approach to God was not some sort of spontaneous or self-designed approach to worship God. God is the one who sets the standard by which He must be approached and worshiped. Not that you get up one day and think, well, I'm just really not feeling that. I'm feeling this. I'm going to approach God this way. No, there's only one way, and that is God's way to come into His presence and to worship Him acceptably. Now, the principle later becomes sort of dramatized in the book of Leviticus. Now, Leviticus does not have very much in the way of historical narration of events, but we do get the account of Nadab and Abihu, who offered what we are told Yahweh commanded them not. They offered something else. They come up with their own idea, and we'll get there later in Leviticus in chapter number 10. So this seriousness of this and Yahweh's inflexible requirements are highlighted again, sort of in a dramatized fashion in that account. Now, the same sacrifice receives the same response. The priest brings it all. It is all burnt upon the altar. It's made by fire, and it ascends as a sweet savor, as a pleasing, satisfying aroma unto the Lord. So really, when we read this, though in this offering we have a sheep or we have a goat, still a male without blemish, just as the bull was in from the herd, but this wording is just the same. In other words, they're fundamentally equivalent in this offering and in this function. Acceptance with God does not depend upon monetary value. In other words, you may have been in Israel and been sort of somewhat middle class, I suppose, medium level in terms of resources. Maybe you didn't own a bull. Maybe you didn't have access to a bull because financially you could not afford it. But you could have brought a goat. You could have brought a sheep from the flock. And that was not a second-class offering, even though it was all that was available to you. The sacrifice depends on approaching Him in the way that He has specified He will be approached. Now we get the third in verses 14 to 17. And if the burnt sacrifice for his offering to the Lord be of fowls, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or of young pigeons, and the priest shall bring it unto the altar, and wring off his head, and burn it on the altar, and the blood thereof shall be wrung out on the side of the altar. And he shall pluck away his crop with his feathers, and cast it beside the altar on the east part, with the place of the ashes. And he shall cleave it with the wings thereof, but shall not divide it asunder. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar, upon the wood that is upon the fire. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. So this is the burnt offering from the birds. This section differs a little bit. Now this is where we see a little bit of a change, but mainly because of the difference in the animals here is so extreme versus what we had previously. I mean, the bird and its body, its anatomy, and the handling of it obviously is just going to be different than handling a bull or even handling a goat for that matter. So there is some difference here, but not substantially, and certainly not in terms of the meaning and the acceptance of what takes place. So he shall bring his offering of the turtle doves or the young pigeons. And so we've gone from bulls to sheep to goats to birds. And Leviticus actually later makes even clearer that there is some economic accommodation within these codes, so that the poorest among them were provided for. They were not cut off. They were not unable to worship Yahweh because they simply didn't have the financial means or resources that someone else did. And so that will be a little more pronounced later in Leviticus. But the sacrifice, the substance of it might vary according to the means, but the results are the same. The access to God is restricted to what He prescribes, and it is not restricted based on economy. Now, the priest in this case does perform the sacrifice, the killing of the animals, but the blood again is brought in connection to the altar. The impurity is removed. It's made clean. It's purified, and there's an intentional distinction between what belongs upon Yahweh's altar and what must be removed, and the sacrifice is then wholly offered to Yahweh. The bird is split. It's not divided up entirely into pieces the way that the bulls or the goats or the sheep were. And the conclusion, again, is identically the same. An offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. So the poor man's bird receives the same concluding statement as the wealthy man's bull. God's appointed way of approach is available, and it wasn't restricted based on any sort of economic standard. Now, as we think about this first chapter, as we're getting into Leviticus, and we're met right away with these codes, and some of these things may sound somewhat strange to us, but we notice that there is a certain pattern within this chapter. There's sort of a commonality. There's a qualified sacrifice that is brought. It must be without blemish. It must be acceptable to the Lord. The worshiper approaches Yahweh through this sacrifice. He comes before the tent of the congregation. The sacrifice dies. Its blood is shed. In each of these cases, it is slaughtered. There's a priestly mediation that occurs. The priests that are handling the blood and the altar, and it's being used to sanctify and to consecrate. And the sacrifice is wholly given to God. It is burned completely upon the altar, and God accepts that offering, the result in a sweet savor unto the Lord. So again, that pattern is the same in all three of these cases, though the animals being offered are different, and different according to economic standard. So the dominant movement, if we're sort of drawing out, what is the theological lesson that is being communicated here in Leviticus chapter 1? It's approach unto Yahweh, the need for substitution, the need for shedding of blood, priestly mediation, a complete offering, and then acceptance and access to Him. Now again, this is not the first time that you encounter sacrifice or offering to the Lord in the Bible. In fact, you encounter it in the book of Genesis. So the burnt offering itself predates Sinai. Noah offered burnt offerings after the flood. Abraham likewise offered a burnt offering. He offered the ram in the place of his son. In fact, in Genesis chapter number 22, which highlights that substitution that is made. So, in other words, sacrifice and offering are not invented here, but they are regulated. And the Old Covenant, and within the Old Covenant, for the newly established tabernacle and priestly system. Now, Exodus, of course, we saw the presence of God, but the presence of God created an immediate problem in Exodus. And so Leviticus is crucial in addressing that problem. I mean, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle at the end of Exodus, but even Moses himself could not enter that tabernacle because of the glory of God within it in chapter 40. And then in Leviticus 1, the Lord calls out to Moses and begins to describe how it is that Israel is going to be able to approach Yahweh, come into His presence, and be able to live with Him in their midst. So that's the question that Leviticus is answered. And how's that going to happen? It's going to happen by sacrifice. It's going to happen by shedding of blood. It's going to happen by priesthood. It's going to happen by purification. It's going to happen by atonement. And it's going to happen by holiness. So in Leviticus, notice that the sacrifice doesn't eliminate the holiness problem. Now, this burnt offerings that we read about in the opening of this book, they provide a real means of ceremonial acceptance under the Old Covenant. But Leviticus itself is still showing us that this access is limited. And that's telling us something that the writer of Hebrews picks up on, as well as other later writers as well. And we get again to that Day of Atonement, where restricted access is actually highlighted. There's a repeated sacrifice, there's priestly mediation, but there's a continuing uncleanness and a continual remembrance of sin, as it was repeated every year. Well, the Old Covenant sacrifices accomplished the function that God appointed for them, but they did not produce final reconciliation or permanent access to God's presence. And of course, the book of Hebrews fills a lot of this in explicitly, how the burnt offerings are a shadow. They're not the final substance. This isn't the last word, and in fact, it's not really the final way of approach into God and living in His presence. These animal sacrifices, then, are figures and shadows of that better that was to come, which of course is fulfilled in the bodily sacrifice of Jesus Christ Himself in the place of sinners, accomplishing what these earlier sacrifices could not, which was a permanent cleansing and reconciliation. So the writer of Hebrews points out that when these things are properly observed, what do they result in? They result in ceremonial cleanness. They result in ceremonial purification. But they don't result in a cleansing of the heart. That was so crucial, that is so needed in order to live. So again, as we study Leviticus, we want to understand what the message of this book is, what it has to contribute to the Pentateuch and to the Bible as a whole, but we also want to understand that all the while that it's pointing us to the greater, to the better, to that reality in Jesus Christ, the once-for-all sacrifice. All right, we will stop here and we will close with a hymn.